Hello again everyone, this is Mike, and this time we're going to be talking about something that's far too neglected by the vast majority, it would seem, of aspiring not only video game artists but comic book artists and concept illustrators in general. Environments for video games, the actual backgrounds. And this is something that, like I said, is not only neglected by a lot of artists as far as just general skill in creating and rendering specific background elements like buildings and perspective or trees or clouds or things of that sort. I really think for a lot of intermediate artists that are already quite comfortable and skilled with creating individual art assets for a game, this could be one of the most important videos you can watch because this is a really critical aspect to sort of theory for a video game artist. This idea of learning to not just think of each thing that you're drawing as its own sort of secluded object. You'd be amazed how much work people put into something that they just spend an incredible amount of time worrying about details that they shouldn't be putting in the first place, because they're really they're trying too hard to render and to sort of impress people with a level of detail in something that would actually look and perform much better in the actual all-inclusive video game. It's about sort of thinking of the role of what you're creating and the sort of visual priority it would have. And this is also a critically important skill for a good art director to have. Someone that basically might have to manage several artists with several different workflow approaches and different rendering styles, different sensibilities as far as use of color and form. And it's very important for a good art director or a good artist working alone on their own game or images for their portfolio to really give a lot of thought into working with the cohesiveness. How well do all of the elements work together, not just visually but in the actual sort of mechanic of video game imagery? Do things that are less important automatically or naturally subordinate themselves or automatically appear on screen far less important than things that are important? So I've gone on the internet and I found some publicly available images of two commercial games that I think are two real visual masterpieces that really illustrate what I'm talking about very, very well. So let's take a look at those. And the first one we're going to look at is a classic game by SNK for the Neo Geo systems called The Last Blade 2. You can see while the backgrounds are absolutely gorgeous and very nicely detailed, their contrast is low. They're made in almost monochromatic or duochromatic themes. There's never any super strong darks or lights in the background, and they just, while they create this beautiful atmosphere for the game to take place in, the background automatically subordinates itself to the more important gameplay elements, visual elements, such as the characters themselves, scoring, the life bars, and stuff like that. And here's another great example. Even when you have very vivid, very bold, and intense backgrounds where something very important is happening, like the building that these characters are in is on fire. The important thing here to keep in mind is that it's been done monochromatically and without pure white or black in the background. And even though it's intense, the characters still show up beautifully against the background. And still, even though there's this sort of subconscious sense of urgency, extreme urgency to the background, it still subordinates itself beautifully to the critical gameplay elements. And here's another example. And this isn't just about color and contrast. It's about level of detail. It's about actual rendering style. You'll see over and over again in beautiful games, especially cartoon-style 2D games, you'll see a theme of backgrounds being rendered in a more painterly manner, almost like most animated films, without any strokes, and with more subtle shading and more texture. And then you'll see the actual characters and important game elements will be the ones not only with strong contrast and brighter colors, but with an actual stroke. So you'll see that, for example, on this screen, you have beautifully muted, mostly monochromatic backgrounds with large areas of the same color family. And then you'll have the actual HUD elements with very bright color, strong contrast, strong darks and lights. And then you can see here, as a good example on these character images, you have some dark stroking around most of the actual characters here to just really help pop the characters and create emphasis. Okay, so here again we've got one last image of Last Blade 2. I highly recommend finding more screenshots and studying this. But anyway, just absolutely gorgeous background, beautiful animated waterfalls, but just the way the background falls into the distance, because it is muted, because it does not have sharp contrast, the way the characters pop out. I mean, this is just an absolute masterpiece of video game art and art directing. So we're going to move on to a modern masterpiece, a game which uses drastically higher resolutions, alpha blending, special effects, scaling, and all of that. But you'll see the same exact guidelines applied. And that modern masterpiece is Rayman Origins by Ubisoft. Absolutely gorgeous game. You can see here, now we're talking about huge resolution, an unlimited potential palette of colors, but that's sort of the point. Just because you can use a virtual infinity of colors doesn't mean you should. Just because you have the resolution to add an incredible level of detail doesn't mean that that's the best decision for the game. So you can see that the art director and the artists that were working on this game very masterfully balanced the level of detail and level of contrast in the different elements to create something that is not only beautiful and sort of luxurious in its amount of texture and detail and a sense of atmosphere, but at all times you've got this great separation in depth and separation in relevance to the actual gameplay. The characters show up beautifully. The foreground separates itself in depth very, very nicely from the background. And I'm just going to quickly go through some other screens so you can see sort of no matter what the theme or the lighting, you've got the same exact idea going on. And notice again some really basic rules that really help in general for not only separation and depth, but relevance to gameplay. Warm colors inherently come forward and feel more important. And as you can see, we've got this background that is beautiful, natural greens and blues, and in general, you'll see that things are more blue in the background and more washed out and sort of faded and pastel-y. And things like the greens, for example, as a general rule, will get more and more yellow and red in them as you come forward. And you can see the brighter brights and darker darks in important video game elements like the character himself. Or these, I think they're called blums, but you can see very easily what's important, and even though this is a static image, you can sort of inherently feel what's moving and relevant on the screen, and what is just some gorgeous background stuff. And here's a couple more screens. Again, the really important object has brighter contrast, warmer colors, more vivid color, brighter brights, darker darks, and the background, as you can see, again, the far background is more blue, and you get more into the yellowish greens and more reddish colors as you come into the foreground. The characters pop up absolutely beautifully from the background, and it just makes a gorgeous image. Let's see how many more we have. Another great example. We've got the very washed out level of detail, no sharp lines, washed out blues, and then we're getting a bit more detail and texture, sharper texture, but still staying very blue, just starting to get a little more of the warmer colors in it. And as we come forward, we're getting into darker darks and lighter lights, but still nothing as sharp or as vivid in contrast compared to the actual relevant gameplay elements. Yeah, you can just see the effect this has. It's gorgeous, but everything you just immediately see by looking at it, what's important. So this next image is perfect to reiterate the importance of knowing when less is more. It's not only important for the ultimate visual quality of the game that you're working on, but it's critically important in the hectic work for video games. You're usually working against horrible deadlines. Even if it's your own project and you don't have a specific deadline that you have to finish the game by, you want to finish the game sometime in your lifetime. And if you're doing the art, you have to know how much work is really necessary. I can't stress this enough, not only in art but in life in general. Knowing where to put effort in, and knowing that to truly make something beautiful, more thought is required than work. It's not just a matter of sitting down and putting in tons and tons of detail. If the image would look better, if the game would look better with that detail omitted, then you've just wasted an incredible amount of time, and you're going to be heartbroken when you eventually, hopefully, realize that you should go in and remove most of the detail you added. And in this case, the backgrounds are a great example. You can see they're almost nothing but shape in the far background. There's almost no detail, incredibly subtle texture. But I've seen so many artists that are tasked with working on a specific thing, and they'll just spend days or more than a week just rendering the hell out of it, adding all kinds of level of detail and shading, when literally if they gave more thought to where it's going in the actual game and what its relevance is based on the rest of the game, the environment, for example, they could have been done in 20 minutes or a half an hour. So one last Rayman Origins image, and again I highly recommend you check out this game and really study how they handle things. It's really a masterpiece of not only just aesthetics in the first place and visual design, but always keeping in mind that it is a video game and that it is critical to the player for clarity, for them to see what's important, for them to not be distracted no matter how beautiful an environment is, for them to not be suddenly distracted by a game element, by a background element, or to get confused as to what is dangerous and what is not, or what is useful, or what a player needs to interact with, and what is simply part of the environment. And now we're going back to the image I started with, which is a mock-up by an artist that I'm working with right now named Renita Orellana, and I will, in the description of this video, post a link to her portfolio. But we're working together on a simple platformer game project to help sort of demonstrate some of these things that I've been talking about in these videos in actual practice. So this is the first sketch she gave to me after we started working on the environments, after I described vaguely what the sort of style I was looking for. I got this very nice, fast mock-up, and the only workflow mistake that I pointed out to her is that this early in the game, this level of time she spent on this level of detail and clarity in the foreground was not only not necessary, it was a sort of a waste of time, and it can not only be unnecessary time spent, but it can actually be counterproductive to the visual style of the game. And I highly recommend this not only in creating game art in general, but fine art painting with actual traditional media or digital painting. I highly recommend the workflow of always working in layers when you can. Obviously in digital art, always work in layers so you can easily edit and move things around and change color and contrast very quickly on individual parts of the image. But also always build the entire image at once. Don't focus on one thing and make it super detailed or very high contrast. The idea is you start blocking in everything as very basic shape and color all at once, so that the way I describe it is pointing a camera at something purposefully very out of focus. All you see are big broad shapes and color and value. You don't see any sharp detail. And then you slowly, the painting or image creation process is slowly bringing everything into focus at the same time. So the idea is that you perfect the general use of color, the general use of value, and the general use of shape on the far background, the middle, and the foreground at the same time, so that every decision you make for one can easily affect the decisions that you make. And if you neglect the far background for too long or the foreground for too long, then you're going to start to break your visual style. Things will start to lose their cohesion. So aside from Renita just being an excellent artist and responding very well to feedback from this initial sketch, probably the biggest contribution I had to the transformation, the very fast transformation from this pleasant but simple mock-up to this beautiful collection of final game art elements in a very short time, was reminding her or instructing her on the use of color and contrast for separation of depth. And you can see in this original mock-up the sky is quite dark, especially at the top, and you have this extremely strong contrast with the bright white clouds, which have very sharp outlines. And then you have the sort of least professional situation with this mock-up is the fact that while being very slightly grayer, these greens in the much further back pine trees here are actually warmer than the greens in the front, and that's the opposite of what should be happening. So that is a huge part of why this looks so much nicer and feels like it has so much more depth. Is now the clouds have soft edges, softer shapes. They blend more naturally into a now much lighter sky. And the colors, you can see this image, which is great. It's sort of the before and after. In fact, this is a quick adjustment I made to her mock-up to show her the direction to go in with color to help pop that depth. And here's a trick for anyone that needs to work on natural landscapes. The trick to push something into the distance is your sky color. Whatever your sky color is, and it's the same exact thing for fine art painting with oils or acrylics. You take the color that something actually is, like in the case of pine trees, they're strong, vivid greens, dark greens. The farther back you need to push that object, the more and more you mix your sky color into it. So in this case, you would sort of grab this sort of medium tone light blue and mix that with whatever the actual color element is. So if the pine trees are the same exact color as these foreground plants, how you would push them back is to just blend that color in with your sky color. And you can see the effect that has. It's just a beautiful separation of depth. Now the far background subordinates itself very, very well, so even if the game is paused, the player will very readily know what part of the screen is actual foreground that they can potentially land on or interact with, and what is just simply very pretty atmospheric background. And finally, to show the things that I've been talking about put to practice, here is some footage of the actual game that Renita and I are working on.